They say the Maya vanished, as if an entire civilization simply stepped into the jungle one day and never returned, as if the cities that once rose above the canopy like mountains made of stone were only a dream. But the truth is far more unsettling, because the Maya did not disappear in a single night of fire or invasion. They faded, slowly, silently, while their temples still stood tall and their kings still spoke to the gods. And that is what makes their fall one of the greatest mysteries in human history, because when the end came, it came to cities that looked eternal, to pyramids that touched the sky, to a world that believed it had mastered time itself. At the height of their power, the Maya built cities so vast they could rival any in the ancient world, hidden deep within the green oceans of the Central American jungle, where towering temples rose above the treetops and stone causeways connected plazas filled with life, markets, ceremonies, and the constant movement of thousands of people. Scribes carving history into stone, astronomers watching the heavens, farmers bringing maize from the fields, and rulers seated high on carved thrones believing their cities would endure as long as the sun continued to rise. These were not primitive settlements swallowed by wilderness. They were complex, highly organized urban centers with palaces, observatories, reservoirs, ball courts, and roads stretching through the forest like arteries. And at the heart of each stood a divine king, believed to be the living bridge between the human world and the gods above, responsible for keeping the balance of the universe intact through ritual, sacrifice, and sacred duty. From cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque, the Maya charted the movements of Venus with astonishing precision, calculated eclipses, and created calendars so accurate they could measure cycles thousands of years into the future. And in doing so, they shaped a culture obsessed with time, with cycles, with the idea that history itself moved in great turning wheels, guided by the will of the gods. But for all their knowledge and power, the Maya world was also a fragile one, built on delicate balances between forest and field, rain and drought, faith and fear. And though their pyramids looked unshakable and their rulers claimed divine authority, the survival of each city depended on forces no king could command, no priest could fully control, and no calendar could perfectly predict. Yet standing in the great plazas during festivals, with incense smoke rising toward painted temples and drums echoing between stone walls, no one would have believed that these cities, alive with music and color, would one day stand empty, their stairways climbed only by vines, and their carvings watched only by the silent eyes of the jungle. Because when you looked at a Maya city in its prime, you saw not decline, not weakness, but the peak of a civilization that seemed certain of its place in the universe, a people who believed their gods walked beside them and their world would endure as long as the stars continued their sacred paths across the sky. And that is where this story truly begins, not with ruin, not with abandonment, but with greatness so complete, so confident, that the idea of collapse felt impossible. Because to understand how the Maya really fell, we must first stand in the shadow of their tallest temples and see the world exactly as they did, a world that looked eternal, balanced, and blessed, just before everything began to change.
Everything that made the Maya world powerful also made it dangerously fragile. And that is the truth few people realize when they imagine these cities as indestructible fortresses of stone rising above the jungle canopy. Because the Maya did not conquer nature, they negotiated with it every single day, and their survival depended on a delicate balance between forest, water, soil, and sky that had to be maintained through both practical labor and sacred ritual. A balance so fine that even a small disruption could ripple outward with devastating consequences. Yet for centuries this system worked with astonishing precision, supporting millions of people across a region with no great rivers like the Nile or the Tigris, no vast open plains for endless farming, only thin soils, seasonal rains, and dense rainforest that had to be carefully managed if life was to flourish. The Maya carved their fields out of the jungle itself, cutting and burning patches of forest to plant maize, beans, and squash, building terraces on hillsides, draining swamps, and constructing raised fields in lowlands where water could be controlled. And in the great cities, they engineered massive reservoirs to capture rainwater during the wet season, storing enough to last through months of dry heat when the sky offered nothing. And this system demanded constant attention, constant labor, and constant faith that the rains would return as they always had before. Because without water, the entire structure of Maya society would begin to crack. Their religion was not separate from this struggle, but woven directly into it. For the Maya believed that the gods controlled the forces of nature, and that it was the duty of kings and priests to maintain cosmic harmony through ceremony, sacrifice, and offerings, ensuring that the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and the crops would grow. And when harvests were good, the people saw proof that their rulers were favored by the gods, that the rituals were working, that the balance of the universe remained intact. But when the rains came late or the crops failed, doubt began to creep like a shadow at the edge of the forest. Because if the king could not persuade the gods, what did that mean for the entire order of the world? This was not a civilization built on endless abundance, but on careful adjustment, on pushing the land just enough to feed growing populations without breaking it, on trusting cycles that had held steady for generations. And the problem with such a system is not that it fails suddenly, but that it begins to strain quietly, invisibly, long before anyone recognizes the danger. Fields must be cleared further from cities, forests grow thinner, soils lose fertility, reservoirs must be expanded, and rituals become more urgent as leaders sense the balance slipping, but do not yet understand why. The Maya world was a masterpiece of adaptation, a society that had learned to thrive in an environment others might have found impossible. But it was also a system with little margin for error, a world where nature was both ally and threat, and where the confidence of kings rested not on armies alone, but on their perceived ability to keep the heavens and earth in harmony. And so when the first true disruptions came, they did not appear as a single dramatic disaster, but as small, troubling signs: a missed rain, a weaker harvest, a longer dry season, whispers that perhaps the gods were not listening as they once had. And in a civilization built entirely on balance, even the faintest shift could become the beginning of something far larger, something that would slowly, almost invisibly, begin to pull the foundations of the Maya world apart.
At first, no one called it a crisis, because drought does not arrive with the sound of collapsing walls or the flash of invading armies. It begins quietly, with a rainy season that starts a little late, a sky that remains clear a little too long, farmers watching the horizon with unease as clouds gather and then dissolve without releasing their gift. And in a world so dependent on predictable cycles, this subtle delay was enough to plant the first seeds of fear, though most believed it was temporary, a test from the gods that would pass as others had before. Yet the following year the rains were again uncertain, uneven, falling heavily in some places while leaving others dry, and the great reservoirs that sustained cities through the dry months did not fill as completely as they should have, forcing leaders to ration water carefully, to stretch supplies that were meant to last longer than nature now allowed. The Maya had faced difficult seasons before, but this time something felt different, because the pattern did not return to normal, it shifted, and with each passing year the dry seasons grew harsher, the intervals between good harvests longer, and the land that had once supported dense populations began to show signs of exhaustion. Soils worn thin by centuries of cultivation produced smaller yields. Forests cleared for fuel and farmland did not regenerate fast enough, and farmers were forced to push farther from city centers, carving fields into marginal land that offered less and demanded more, all while the population continued to grow, mouths multiplying even as the earth offered less in return. In the great cities, kings and priests intensified their rituals, calling for larger ceremonies, grander offerings, more dramatic displays of devotion meant to restore cosmic balance, and crowds gathered in plazas to watch as captives were sacrificed, as blood was offered to the gods, as incense thickened the air. And for a time, these acts reassured people that their leaders were doing everything possible. Yet when the rains still did not come, when crops still failed, when hunger began to creep into homes that had once known stability, faith began to erode in ways that no ritual could easily repair. Water became the most precious resource of all, guarded carefully, rationed strictly, and in some cities disputes broke out over access to reservoirs and wells, tensions rising between districts, between elites and commoners, between those who still had enough and those who did not. And the social harmony that had once defined Maya urban life began to fracture under the pressure of scarcity. Trade networks that had long connected cities, bringing in food, obsidian, salt, and luxury goods, became strained as each region struggled with its own shortages, and alliances that had been built on mutual benefit grew fragile when survival itself came into question. Because in times of abundance, cooperation is easy, but in times of hunger, every city must think first of its own people. The landscape itself began to change. Lakes shrank, riverbeds dried, forests thinned, and the great stone cities that had once seemed perfectly adapted to their environment now felt exposed, their reliance on stored water and distant fields revealing a vulnerability that had always been there, but had never before been tested so severely. And still, the Maya did not see this as the beginning of an irreversible decline. They saw it as a terrible period that could be endured, a cycle that would eventually turn. Yet with each failed harvest and each empty reservoir, the strain deepened, and the balance that had sustained their civilization for centuries grew more unstable, like a structure that appears solid from a distance, but whose supports are slowly weakening, unseen, until one day the weight becomes too much to bear.
In a world where kings ruled not only through power but through sacred duty, every failed harvest became more than an agricultural problem. It became a spiritual crisis, because the Maya believed their rulers were intermediaries between humanity and the gods, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance of the cosmos. And when the skies withheld rain and the earth yielded less food, it was not nature that people blamed first. It was the king, whose blood rituals, whose ceremonies, whose offerings were supposed to keep the universe in harmony. And as drought stretched from one year into the next, whispers began to spread through marketplaces and among the workers in the fields. Quiet questions about whether the gods were displeased, whether the king had failed, whether the sacred order itself was weakening. Priests responded with urgency, urging rulers to conduct ever more elaborate ceremonies, to spill more royal blood, to dedicate new monuments, to carve new stelae proclaiming their devotion and power. And in city after city, stone monuments rose depicting kings in triumphant poses, dressed in divine regalia, presenting themselves as chosen guardians of cosmic stability. Yet beneath these carved declarations lay a growing anxiety, because monuments could not refill reservoirs, and rituals could not make crops grow in dry soil. The people still gathered in great plazas, still watched the rituals, still listened to the chants that echoed off stone walls, but something subtle had changed. Belief was no longer effortless, it required reassurance. And reassurance required spectacle, and spectacle demanded resources, labor, food, and time, all of which were becoming scarcer. As food supplies tightened, the burden of supporting temples, nobles, and ceremonial life weighed more heavily on farmers, who were expected to provide tribute even when their own families struggled. And resentment, though rarely spoken openly, began to simmer, because hunger makes devotion harder. And when a system demands more while giving less, loyalty erodes slowly, almost invisibly, until one day it simply is not there anymore. Some cities doubled down on religious activity, convinced that greater devotion would bring divine favor, while others quietly reduced their ceremonies, focusing instead on survival. And this difference in response created unevenness across the Maya world, where some centers clung to tradition with desperate intensity, while others adapted, restructured, or began to weaken in ways that could not easily be reversed. Inscriptions from this period still boast of victories, alliances, and ritual events, but between the lines, historians see signs of strain, longer gaps between monument dedications, abrupt endings to royal lineages, evidence that rulers were struggling to maintain the grand cycles of time that had once defined Maya political life. And each interruption in these cycles chipped away at the perception that kings were eternal anchors of order. When faith in a ruler's sacred role weakens, power becomes fragile, because the authority of Maya kings was never based solely on force. It was based on belief. And belief, once cracked, does not shatter all at once. It fractures slowly, spreading through a society in ways that are hard to detect, until the moment comes when people no longer look to the palace for answers, no longer trust that rituals will save them, no longer see their ruler as the chosen guardian of the universe. And in that quiet shift from faith to doubt lies one of the most powerful forces that contributed to the unraveling of the Maya world.
For centuries, Maya cities had competed not only through war and alliance, but through architecture. Each new temple, each towering pyramid, each carved monument was a statement that this city was powerful, favored by the gods, destined to endure. And that competition drove rulers to build ever larger ceremonial centers that reshaped the landscape itself, raising stone mountains from jungle earth and covering plazas with gleaming limestone that reflected the sun like a mirror of divine authority. These projects required enormous labor, thousands of workers quarrying stone, hauling blocks, shaping carvings, plastering surfaces, maintaining causeways that connected districts of the city. And during times of abundance, this system functioned because farmers could produce surplus food to support the workers, and the elite could redistribute resources in ways that reinforced loyalty. But as environmental stress increased and harvests became less reliable, the same building projects that once symbolized prosperity began to strain the very foundations of society. Because the labor did not stop when food grew scarce, the expectations did not shrink when reservoirs dried, and the need to demonstrate divine favor through grand construction remained constant even as the means to sustain it weakened. Kings who had built their legitimacy on monumental achievements could not easily step back without appearing weak, and so construction continued, sometimes at a reduced pace, sometimes with more pressure placed on surrounding communities to provide tribute, labor, and goods, and each demand pulled a little more from a system already under stress. Archaeologists can see this strain in unfinished structures, in monuments that were planned but never completed, in plazas that show signs of hurried or lower quality construction compared to earlier generations. Subtle clues that the machinery of state was still moving, but with less fuel, less coordination, less stability. For the common people, the burden was tangible. More days spent working on royal projects, less time tending their own fields, more tribute demanded in maize, textiles, or goods, even when their families felt the edge of hunger. And while open rebellion was rare, quiet withdrawal became more common. People leaving urban centers for smaller settlements, choosing subsistence over participation in a system that no longer guaranteed security. The great cities depended on constant input from their hinterlands, and when that input faltered, when fewer goods arrived, when fewer labor pools shrank, the glittering ceremonial cores that had once drawn thousands began to feel hollow, their plazas still wide and imposing, but less crowded, their temples still tall, but less frequently used for grand displays of power.
Elites, sensing the change, may have responded with attempts to reassert control, to remind their populations of the sacred order. But control becomes harder when resources decline, and when the promise of prosperity no longer matches lived reality. The cost of greatness, once an investment that yielded stability and prestige, became a liability, locking cities into patterns of consumption and display that they no longer afford. And in that imbalance between expectation and capacity lay another quiet force pulling at the threads of Maya civilization, a slow economic and social exhaustion that made the system less flexible, less resilient, less able to respond to crises, until even small shocks could tip the balance from strain into collapse.
As the material foundations of Maya cities weakened, political unity began to erode in ways that were less visible than drought or failing harvests, but just as destructive. Because Maya civilization was never a single empire, but a web of independent city-states linked by alliances, rivalries, marriages, trade, and ritual obligations, and that web depended on constant negotiation, shared beliefs, and a balance of power that could shift rapidly when conditions changed. In times of strength, powerful cities could dominate their neighbors, enforce tribute, and create spheres of influence that brought relative stability. But when resources declined and internal pressures mounted, the incentives that once encouraged cooperation gave way to suspicion, competition, and conflict, as rulers sought to secure their own survival first. Inscriptions carved into stone stelae tell of wars, captures of rival kings, shifting alliances, and sudden breaks between former partners. And while warfare had always been part of Maya political life, in the later centuries it appears to have intensified, becoming more frequent and more disruptive, as cities that once balanced rivalry with diplomacy moved toward cycles of retaliation and instability. Trade routes that had carried obsidian, jade, cacao, feathers, and other goods across vast distances became less reliable when political relations soured or when safe passage could no longer be guaranteed. And without steady trade, the economic networks that supported elites and artisans began to falter, reducing the flow of prestige goods that underpinned social hierarchies. For ordinary people, this political fragmentation meant greater uncertainty, because alliances that once protected communities could dissolve, leaving towns exposed to raids or forced to shift loyalties quickly, and each change of allegiance could bring new demands for tribute, labor, or military support. Rulers, feeling their authority slip, may have responded with more aggressive policies, seeking military victories to restore prestige or conducting elaborate rituals to reaffirm their divine mandate. But victories became harder to secure when armies were drawn from populations already strained by food shortages and economic pressure. Fortifications appear at some sites that had not needed them before, walls built or strengthened, defensive positions carved into hillsides, evidence that fear of attack had become a more constant presence in daily life. These defensive measures, while providing short-term security, also signaled a shift from open networks of exchange and ceremony toward more isolated, self-protective communities, and isolation further reduced the flow of goods, ideas, and support that had once tied the region together.
Political fragmentation is rarely a single dramatic event. It is a gradual unraveling, a series of small breaks in trust, loyalty, and cooperation. And in the Maya world, those breaks accumulated over generations, turning a vibrant mosaic of interconnected cities into a patchwork of wary rivals. Without strong, stable alliances, no city could rely on others in times of crisis, and when drought, famine, or internal unrest struck, each polity faced its struggles alone, accelerating decline and making recovery less likely. In this atmosphere of fractured power, the resilience that had allowed Maya civilization to thrive for centuries diminished, and the network that once amplified strength began instead to transmit weakness, carrying instability from one region to another until the entire system trembled under its own divided weight.
Even the greatest monuments in the Maya world depended on something far more fragile than stone, because behind every pyramid, every carved stela, every painted palace wall stood thousands of people who needed food every single day. And as environmental strain and political fragmentation intensified, many cities reached a point where their agricultural systems could no longer reliably support the populations they had once proudly sustained. The classic Maya heartland was never an easy environment for large urban centers, with thin soils, seasonal rains, and dense forests that had to be carefully managed, and earlier generations had responded with ingenuity, creating terraces, raised fields, reservoirs, and complex water management systems. But these systems required constant labor, maintenance, and coordination, and when social stability weakened, that maintenance faltered. Fields that were once carefully rotated could become overused, terraces could erode, canals could clog, and reservoirs could fill with silt, reducing their effectiveness just when they were needed most. And each small failure compounded the next, lowering yields and increasing vulnerability to even minor shifts in rainfall. As harvests became less predictable, rulers still needed to extract tribute to support courts, rituals, and construction, and this pressure could push farming communities beyond sustainable limits, forcing them to clear more land, shorten fallow periods, or cultivate marginal soils that quickly degraded, creating a downward spiral in which short-term survival undermined long-term productivity. Archaeological evidence from some sites suggests malnutrition became more common in later periods, seen in skeletal remains that show signs of stress, stunted growth, or disease. And while not universal, these signs hint at populations living closer to the edge than before, with less buffer against poor harvests or social disruption. When food became scarce, people had options, but none were easy. Because they could endure and hope conditions improved, they could resist demands from elites and risk punishment, or they could leave, abandoning homes, fields, and temples in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Migration may have been gradual at first, families slipping away to less crowded regions, but over time such departures could hollow out communities, leaving fewer hands to maintain infrastructure and fewer supporters to uphold political and ritual systems. Large ceremonial centers that once hosted bustling markets and grand festivals could begin to feel emptier, their plazas less crowded, their construction projects slowing, not because knowledge or faith had vanished, but because the human energy that powered those achievements was being quietly drained away.
Food scarcity also heightened tensions within cities as competition for resources increased, and social hierarchies that once seemed justified by prosperity could appear oppressive in times of hardship, leading to unrest or declining loyalty to rulers who claimed divine favor yet could not ensure stable harvests. In such conditions, the very scale that had once been a sign of success became a liability, because large urban populations were harder to feed, more dependent on complex supply systems, and more vulnerable to disruption. And when those systems faltered, cities that had seemed eternal could begin to shrink, their grandeur outlasting the social foundations that made it possible.
What makes the story of the Maya collapse so haunting is not the image of cities burning or armies smashing gates, but the far quieter reality that many of the greatest urban centers of the classic Maya world appear to have been slowly and deliberately abandoned by their own people, as if entire populations simply decided over time that staying no longer made sense. Archaeologists do not find widespread layers of ash or destruction at many southern lowland sites. Instead, they find unfinished buildings, monuments that were never completed, and plazas that gradually stopped being used, suggesting that daily life faded away rather than being violently erased. This kind of abandonment is more difficult to imagine because it lacks a single dramatic moment, yet it may be far more devastating because it reflects a long process of disillusionment, adaptation, and migration in which families chose survival over tradition and left behind cities that had defined their identities for generations. As food systems struggled, water management faltered, and political authority weakened, people may have begun to ask practical questions that outweighed religious or cultural attachments, questions about where crops would grow more reliably, where conflict was less intense, and where communities could rebuild stability. And when the answers pointed away from the great ceremonial centers, the flow of people outward could have become steady and irreversible. We can imagine households packing up tools, seeds, and ritual objects, leaving homes that had been lived in for decades, perhaps intending to return someday. Yet as more neighbors departed, the social fabric that made city life viable thinned, markets shrank, labor pools diminished, and public works became impossible to sustain. Temples that once hosted elaborate ceremonies might still have stood, but without large gatherings, without the noise of festivals and the constant movement of traders, artisans, and farmers, the city would have felt different, emptier, its meaning slowly dissolving. The rulers and elites who depended on dense populations for labor and tribute would have found their power eroding, not necessarily through open rebellion, but through quiet absence, as fewer people showed up to build, to farm elite lands, or to participate in the rituals that legitimized royal authority. Over time, even the most sacred spaces could fall out of use, stelae left uncarved, inscriptions unfinished, calendars unmarked, as the political and religious systems that structured urban life lost the critical mass of participants needed to function. Nature then began to reclaim what humans left behind, vegetation creeping into plazas, roots pushing apart stone blocks, animals returning to spaces once dominated by human activity, so that within a few generations, cities that had been vibrant hubs of culture and power were transformed into overgrown ruins hidden beneath the forest canopy. This was not the end of the Maya people, who continued to live in other regions and adapt to new realities, but it was the end of a particular way of organizing society on a monumental scale, and the silence that settled over the abandoned cities speaks not of sudden annihilation, but of a long human process of choosing to move on when the old system no longer worked. After people drifted away from the great Maya cities of the southern lowlands, the change was not marked by a single dramatic moment, but by a slow transformation that unfolded year after year, season after season, as nature quietly reclaimed spaces that had once been shaped and maintained by human hands. Without constant clearing, terraces and fields began to fill with weeds and shrubs, irrigation channels clogged with sediment and plant growth, and the carefully managed landscape that had supported dense populations gradually reverted toward a more natural state. Trees took root in plazas where thousands had once gathered, their roots prying apart stone paving, while vines crept up temple stairways that had once been swept and repaired by laborers under royal command. What had been centers of power and ceremony slowly became islands of crumbling architecture surrounded by thickening forest, and the absence of people was felt not only in the silence of empty courtyards, but in the changing rhythms of the ecosystem itself. Animals that had been pushed to the margins by agriculture and urban life returned in greater numbers. Birds nested in abandoned structures, and the sounds of wildlife replaced the noise of markets, construction, and ritual gatherings. For those who left, the forest's return may have seemed both familiar and unsettling, a reminder that the landscape they had reshaped so extensively still held its own long memory and could outlast human designs. The physical traces of the cities did not vanish overnight, but their meaning shifted as buildings lost their social context, becoming relics rather than living spaces, monuments without the communities that had given them purpose. In later generations, descendants of the Maya might have passed near these overgrown ruins and known that their ancestors had built them, yet the practical realities of daily life would have tied them to new settlements, new fields, and new local networks of exchange and belief. The forest's gradual takeover also helped conceal the scale of what had once existed, making it harder for outside observers in later centuries to imagine that these remote, jungle-covered mounds had once been bustling cities with sophisticated political systems, calendars, and artistic traditions. In this way, the environment did not cause the collapse on its own, but it played a crucial role in erasing the visible evidence of urban life, reinforcing the sense that a chapter had closed. The disappearance of monumental urbanism in the southern lowlands was therefore both a human and ecological story, one in which declining populations, shifting settlements, and environmental recovery became intertwined. The forest's quiet advance
did not celebrate or mourn the passing of the classic Maya cities. It simply followed its own logic, filling spaces left open by human retreat. Yet to us, looking back across the centuries, the image of towering pyramids half buried in vegetation has become one of the most powerful symbols of the Maya collapse, a visual reminder that even the grandest human achievements can be overtaken by time, growth, and the patient persistence of the natural world.
While many of the great classic cities in the southern lowlands faded, Maya civilization itself did not disappear, and in other regions new centers of power rose that adapted to changing conditions and reshaped political life in ways that reflected both continuity and transformation. In the northern lowlands, cities such as Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and later Mayapan became important hubs, drawing people, goods, and ideas into networks that differed from those of the earlier classic period, but were no less dynamic in their own right. These northern centers often developed in landscapes with different rainfall patterns and access to water sources like cenotes, natural sinkholes that provided more reliable supplies during dry seasons, giving them a degree of resilience against some of the environmental pressures that had strained southern regions. Architectural styles evolved as well, with new decorative motifs, columned halls, and expanded marketplaces, suggesting shifts in how power was displayed and how urban space was organized. Instead of the highly personalized divine kingship that had dominated the classic era, political authority in some northern cities appears to have been shared among broader elite groups, perhaps reflecting lessons learned from earlier instability and a desire to spread risk rather than concentrate it in a single ruler. Trade connections across Mesoamerica also grew in importance, linking the Maya more closely with central Mexican cultures and bringing new goods, technologies, and artistic influences that reshaped local traditions. Obsidian, turquoise, feathers, and other prestige items circulated through expanding exchange networks, and coastal trade routes along the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean Sea helped sustain urban life, even as inland patterns shifted. These developments show that the story of the Maya after the classic collapse was not simply one of decline, but of reorganization, innovation, and adaptation to new realities. The population did not vanish, it redistributed, concentrating in areas where resources were more dependable or where new political arrangements offered greater stability. Religious practices and calendar traditions continued, but they were expressed through different architectural forms and regional styles that reflected changing identities and alliances. The rise of these post-classic centers also reminds us that what we call collapse often looks, from the perspective of those living through it, more like transition, with loss in some places balanced by growth in others. The memory of the old southern capitals may have lingered in stories and sacred histories, but daily life moved forward,
shaped by new leaders, new trade routes, and new environmental strategies. In this way, the fall of one urban system became the foundation for another, and the resilience of Maya society lay not in preserving every city forever, but in its ability to reorganize, migrate, and reinvent itself across a diverse and changing landscape.
Centuries after the great southern cities had fallen silent, a new experiment in unity emerged in the northern Yucatan, where the city of Mayapan became the center of a political alliance that historians often call the League of Mayapan, one of the last large-scale attempts to bind multiple Maya polities under a shared framework of power. This league brought together leading families and cities in a loose confederation that balanced cooperation with rivalry, creating a system designed to reduce the destructive warfare that had plagued earlier centuries, while still allowing regional elites to maintain influence. Mayapan itself was densely populated and heavily fortified, its walls enclosing temples, plazas, and administrative compounds that reflected both traditional Maya forms and newer influences from other parts of Mesoamerica. The political structure appears to have been more collective than the divine kingship of the classic era, with ruling lineages sharing authority in councils and alliances that shifted over time, suggesting a deliberate move away from the concentration of power that had once made cities vulnerable to sudden collapse if a single dynasty failed. Trade flourished under this arrangement, and Mayapan became a hub connecting inland farming communities, coastal traders, and long-distance exchange networks that carried goods such as salt, cacao, obsidian, and cotton textiles across the region. Religious life also continued to evolve, blending older Maya traditions with new ceremonial practices and architectural styles that reflected the region's changing connections. Yet beneath this apparent stability, familiar pressures were building once again as competition among elite families intensified and alliances frayed under the strain of ambition, mistrust, and unequal access to wealth. The very system designed to prevent collapse contained seeds of future conflict, because shared power required constant negotiation and restraint, qualities that were difficult to sustain across generations. As rival factions struggled for dominance, tensions grew within the League, and political violence began to undermine the unity that had once seemed to promise a more durable future. The story of Mayapan shows that the Maya continued to innovate politically long after the classic collapse, experimenting with new forms of governance in an effort to learn from the past. But it also reveals how deeply rooted patterns of rivalry and shifting alliances remained part of the political landscape. Stability, once again, proved to be a temporary balance rather than a permanent solution, and the League's eventual breakdown would echo earlier cycles of fragmentation, reminding us that Maya history was marked not by a single fall, but by repeated efforts to rebuild order in a world where environmental challenges, economic demands, and human ambitions constantly pulled in different directions. The alliance that had once held the League of Mayapan together did not break in a single dramatic moment, but unraveled through years of rising suspicion, factional rivalry, and political violence that gradually transformed cooperation into open conflict. Competing noble families within Mayapan, each with their own networks of allies in surrounding towns and cities, began to maneuver for greater influence, using marriage alliances, trade partnerships, and religious patronage as tools in a slow struggle for dominance. As trust eroded, the mechanisms that had allowed shared rule to function started to fail, and decisions that once would have been negotiated in council became sources of resentment and accusation. Archaeological evidence suggests that fortifications were strengthened and that parts of the city were reorganized defensively, signs that leaders anticipated internal as well as external threats. The situation escalated into civil war when one powerful lineage attempted to assert control over the League, provoking resistance from rival groups who feared losing their autonomy and status. Fighting spread through the region, drawing in allied communities and disrupting the trade routes and agricultural systems that had supported prosperity. Fields were abandoned as farmers fled violence, and markets that once bustled with exchange fell silent, replaced by the uncertainty of a landscape divided by shifting battle lines. The conflict was not a clash between foreign invaders and a united Maya world, but a struggle among Maya factions themselves, each convinced of the legitimacy of its claims, and each willing to use force to secure its position. Temples and palaces that had symbolized shared power became contested spaces, and the social fabric that bound the League together frayed under the strain of fear and retaliation. Eventually, the violence reached a point where Mayapan itself was attacked and partially destroyed, its political center shattered, and its population dispersed. Survivors fled to smaller towns and rural areas, carrying with them traditions, knowledge, and memories of a failed experiment in unity. The fall of Mayapan did not mark the end of Maya civilization, but rather the end of one more attempt to create large-scale political cohesion in a region where geography, history, and deeply rooted patterns of local autonomy made lasting centralization extremely difficult. The Civil War of the North reveals that the final phase of pre-Hispanic Maya political history was shaped less by environmental disaster than by human decisions, rival ambitions, and the fragile nature of alliances, showing once again that the story of Maya collapse was as much about internal division as it was about external pressures.
After the destruction of Mayapan, the political landscape of the northern Yucatan Peninsula did not dissolve into chaos, but reorganized into a mosaic of smaller, independent kingdoms that each sought to protect their autonomy while navigating a world shaped by the memory of failed centralization.
Power shifted away from large confederations toward localized centers, where ruling lineages focused on defending their territories, maintaining regional trade, and reinforcing their legitimacy through ritual and lineage traditions that connected them to the ancient past. Instead of a single dominant capital, dozens of towns and small cities emerged as political hubs, each with its own council of nobles, temple complexes, and networks of allied villages. This fragmentation created a more flexible, but also more fragile system, one in which diplomacy, marriage alliances, and shifting partnerships replaced the broader structures that had once linked major regions together. Trade continued, especially along coastal routes where canoe traffic connected communities across the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, allowing the exchange of salt, cotton textiles, honey, cacao, and obsidian. Yet these networks were now more regional than pan-Mesoamerican, reflecting a world that had turned inward after generations of upheaval. Religious life remained vibrant, with temples still active and rituals marking the agricultural calendar, but spiritual authority was increasingly tied to local shrines and community traditions rather than to grand pilgrimage centers that once drew visitors from far away. The memory of earlier collapses influenced how leaders governed. Rulers were cautious about overextending their power and wary of alliances that might entangle them in distant conflicts. Defensive architecture became more common, with some towns built on elevated ground or surrounded by walls and natural barriers, signs of a society that expected threats from neighbors as much as from outsiders. Despite these precautions, everyday life for most people continued in familiar rhythms, shaped by farming, craft production, and local markets where goods and stories circulated together. Children grew up hearing tales of ancient cities swallowed by forest, and of once mighty kings whose ambitions had brought ruin, stories that served both as warnings and as sources of identity. The world of smaller kingdoms was not a decline into obscurity, but a transformation, a rebalancing of power that allowed Maya culture to persist in forms better suited to a fragmented political environment. However, this decentralized system meant that when new forces would eventually arrive from across the sea, there would be no single authority capable of coordinating a unified response, and the legacy of fragmentation would shape the way the next great upheaval unfolded. Long before foreign sails appeared on the horizon, stories began to travel inland from the coasts, carried by traders, fishermen, and messengers who spoke of strange floating houses seen far out at sea, vessels unlike any canoe, with tall white wings that caught the wind and moved against the current with unsettling ease. At first, these tales were treated as exaggerations, the kind of coastal myths that always seemed to grow in the telling. But as more witnesses described similar sights, curiosity turned into unease. Coastal communities had long been the eyes and ears of the Maya world,
their merchants traveling between ports and bringing news of distant lands, and now their reports hinted at a presence that did not fit into any known pattern of trade or warfare. Some said the newcomers were gods, others that they were spirits or demons emerging from the eastern sea, while more practical voices suspected they were simply another group of humans, though unlike any the Maya had encountered before. The uncertainty itself became a source of tension, for in a world already divided into many small kingdoms, the question of how to respond to an unknown power was difficult to answer collectively. Rulers inland received conflicting information, some dismissing the rumors as distant curiosities, others beginning to consider the possibility that new alliances or defensive measures might be needed. Priests and diviners were consulted, and rituals were performed to seek guidance from the gods, who were asked whether these strangers were a sign of coming change or merely a passing anomaly. Meanwhile, coastal trade routes continued to function, but with a growing sense that the sea, once a familiar highway of exchange, had become a frontier of uncertainty. Fishermen scanning the horizon no longer looked only for storms or rival canoes, but for the faint shapes of large ships that seemed to belong to another world. In markets and village plazas, people whispered about pale-skinned men in shining clothing, about animals taller than a man that carried riders on their backs, and about weapons that made thunder and smoke, though few could say whether these details were true or products of fearful imagination. The rumors spread unevenly, shaped by distance, politics, and belief, but everywhere they reached, they added another layer of instability to a landscape already fragmented by generations of internal change. No single ruler could claim authority over the entire region, and no shared strategy emerged, only a patchwork of reactions, ranging from indifference to alarm. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the Maya world stood on the edge of a new chapter, not yet aware that the stories from the coast were not isolated wonders, but the first signals of an encounter that would reshape the fate of every kingdom, large and small, across the lowlands and highlands alike.
When the strangers finally stepped onto Maya shores, the meeting between worlds was not marked by a single dramatic clash, but by a series of cautious, confusing encounters, shaped by curiosity, fear, and misunderstanding on both sides. Coastal communities saw men unlike any they had known before, with metal helmets that caught the sun, clothing of strange fabrics, and animals that looked like deer, yet moved with a speed and power that made them seem almost supernatural. The newcomers, for their part, found themselves in a land dense with forests, dotted with towns and cities whose temples rose above the trees, a world already old, organized, and rich with its own traditions. Communication was a challenge from the very first moment. Gestures and fragments of shared language slowly building a fragile bridge between cultures that had developed in isolation for millennia. Gifts were exchanged in some places, food, cloth, and small objects offered as signs of peaceful intent,
while in other encounters suspicion quickly turned to hostility, especially when demands for tribute or obedience followed initial greetings. The Maya were no strangers to warfare or diplomacy, but the newcomers operated according to different rules, driven by a combination of ambition, religious conviction, and the promise of wealth that made them relentless in their pursuit of influence. News of these encounters spread inland, just as earlier rumors had, but now the stories were more concrete, describing men who carried weapons that roared like thunder and could strike from a distance, who seemed immune to fear and eager to form alliances with local rivals. Some Maya rulers saw an opportunity, believing they could use the newcomers as allies against traditional enemies, while others viewed them as a threat that needed to be resisted at all costs. These differing reactions deepened existing divisions, as no single authority could coordinate a unified response across the region. Priests tried to interpret the arrival of the strangers within established cosmological frameworks, searching for omens and prophecies that might explain the unprecedented event, while ordinary people focused on more immediate concerns, the safety of their families, the stability of their harvests, and the reliability of the leaders who claimed to protect them. In many places, daily life continued alongside the growing presence of the foreigners. Markets opened, fields were tended, and rituals were performed. Yet an undercurrent of tension ran through every interaction. Each meeting carried the possibility of alliance, trade, or sudden violence, and every decision made by a local ruler had consequences that could ripple far beyond a single city. The first contacts did not immediately destroy the Maya world, but they introduced a powerful new force into an already complex political landscape, one that would amplify existing rivalries, strain fragile systems of authority, and set in motion a chain of events that would prove far more disruptive than anyone at the time could fully grasp.
Long before large battles reshaped the political map of the Maya world, an unseen enemy began moving quietly from village to village, traveling faster than any army and striking without warning or mercy. The newcomers carried with them diseases that had circulated for centuries in distant lands, illnesses to which their own bodies had slowly adapted, but which were entirely new to the peoples of Mesoamerica. At first, the sickness appeared as something small, a fever here, a rash there, a child who did not recover from what seemed like an ordinary illness, yet within weeks entire households were falling ill at once. Communities that had already been weakened by drought, warfare, and food shortages now faced a crisis that no ritual, no medicine, and no political decision could easily resolve. Healers tried herbs, steam baths, prayers, and offerings to the gods, but the diseases spread with terrifying speed, cutting through all levels of society, from farmers in remote villages to nobles within the stone walls of great cities. The social fabric of Maya life began to tear as key figures died unexpectedly: leaders, scribes, priests and artisans whose skills and knowledge had taken decades to master. Fields went untended when entire families were struck down, irrigation systems fell into disrepair, and trade routes became less reliable as fear of contagion kept people from traveling. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one, for in a world where balance between humans, gods, and nature was believed to be essential, such widespread suffering seemed like a sign that something had gone deeply wrong at a cosmic level. Ritual activity increased in many places as communities sought to restore harmony through ceremonies, offerings, and bloodletting. Yet the continued spread of disease undermined confidence in both religious and political authorities. Some rulers were blamed for failing to maintain the favor of the gods, while others lost their positions simply because they died before they could respond to the crisis. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, alliances shifted and old rivalries reignited as cities competed for shrinking resources and struggled to maintain control over their populations. The newcomers did not always understand the full impact of the diseases they carried, but their presence accelerated the spread as they moved between regions, trading, negotiating, and fighting. By the time large-scale military campaigns intensified, many Maya communities were already weakened, their populations reduced, their leadership structures disrupted, and their sense of stability shattered. The invisible enemy had done what no single rival city had ever achieved. It had struck at the foundations of society itself, leaving the Maya world more vulnerable to external pressures and less able to mount a unified, effective response to the profound challenges that lay ahead. As the years passed, many once thriving Maya cities began to feel strangely hollow, their plazas still standing in silent grandeur, while the life that had once animated them slowly faded away. The great ceremonial centers that had echoed with music, ritual chants, and the steady rhythm of daily markets grew quieter as populations declined and people drifted towards smaller, more defensible settlements or into the countryside where food might be easier to secure. Monumental architecture remained, towering pyramids, carved stelae, palace complexes, but the human networks that gave these places meaning were fraying. Skilled artisans who had carved intricate reliefs and painted vibrant murals were fewer in number, and long-distance trade that had once brought exotic goods and ideas into the heart of Maya cities became less reliable. Without steady flows of resources, elite courts struggled to maintain the displays of wealth and generosity that reinforced their authority. Public ceremonies, once grand demonstrations of cosmic order and political power, became more modest or less frequent, and in some cities they stopped altogether. The silence of abandoned buildings carried a powerful symbolic weight, for Maya cities were not just places to live, they were sacred landscapes where the movements of rulers, priests, and common people mirrored the movements of the cosmos. When plazas stood empty and temples fell into disuse, it suggested that the balance between human society and the divine order had been broken.
Migration played a crucial role in this transformation, as families chose to leave crowded, unstable centers in search of safer or more fertile regions. This movement was not always chaotic. In some cases, it was gradual and organized, with communities relocating together, bringing their traditions and skills with them. But it still meant that older cities lost the critical mass of population needed to sustain complex political and religious institutions. Some centers adapted by becoming smaller, more localized hubs, while others were simply left behind, their monuments slowly reclaimed by vegetation and time. The decline was uneven across the Maya world, with some regions maintaining relative stability, while others experienced sharper drops in population and activity. Yet the overall pattern pointed to a shift away from the large, densely populated urban centers that had defined the height of classic Maya civilization. The loss of population had ripple effects on every aspect of life. Fewer farmers meant less surplus food. Fewer laborers meant less capacity to maintain infrastructure. And fewer elites meant weaker coordination of regional networks. In this quieter, more fragmented landscape, the grand voices of the old cities no longer dominated the horizon, and the political map of the Maya world began to change in ways that would permanently reshape its future.
In the wake of urban decline, the Maya world did not collapse into emptiness, but instead transformed into a more fragmented and regionally diverse landscape, where smaller communities and new centers of power emerged from the shadow of the old great cities. Without the dominance of massive classic period capitals, authority became more localized and political structures shifted towards smaller polities that were often more flexible but also more vulnerable. These communities adapted to changing environmental and social conditions in different ways, some focusing on mixed subsistence strategies that combined farming, foraging, and smaller-scale trade, while others developed defensive settlements on hilltops or in more easily protected locations. The disappearance of many monumental building programs meant that labor and resources were redirected toward everyday survival rather than grand displays of royal power. Religious practices also evolved as local traditions gained prominence and the elaborate court-centered rituals of the classic era gave way to more community-focused expressions of belief. This was not a cultural vacuum, but a reorganization, a shift in how people related to authority, to the land, and to each other. Long-distance trade networks shrank but did not vanish, with coastal and riverine routes becoming especially important in linking scattered communities. In some regions, new centers rose that would later define the post-classic period, showing that Maya civilization remained dynamic and creative even after the decline of its classic urban giants. Yet the memory of the old cities lingered in stories, in the enduring presence of their ruins, and in the symbolic power of their monuments. For people living among these remnants, the towering pyramids and carved stones were reminders of a past age of extraordinary achievement, and they likely inspired both pride and caution. The political fragmentation of this period made large-scale coordination more difficult, limiting the ability to respond collectively to external threats or internal crises, but it also fostered resilience at the local level as communities relied more heavily on their own networks and knowledge. Over time, this mosaic of smaller polities created a different kind of Maya world, less centralized but still deeply rooted in shared cultural traditions such as writing, calendrical knowledge, and ritual practices. The transformation illustrates that what is often called collapse was in many ways a decentralization, a rebalancing of social complexity rather than a total disappearance of civilization. The Maya adapted to a world where the old model of kings ruling over vast monument-filled capitals was no longer sustainable, and in doing so, they laid the foundations for new forms of political and cultural life that would endure for centuries.
Long after the great classic cities had fallen quiet, their presence continued to shape the lives and imaginations of the people who remained in the Maya world. For the ruins were never truly abandoned in spirit, even when they were no longer centers of daily life. Vines crept over carved stone, trees rooted themselves in palace courtyards, and rainwater pooled in the cracked plazas. Yet the outlines of temples and pyramids still rose above the forest canopy, visible from afar, like silent mountains built by human hands. Travelers passing through these landscapes would have seen the remnants of colossal stairways and weathered glyphs, and known that they stood in places once filled with ceremony, authority, and cosmic significance. The ruins became part of a sacred geography, places where ancestors had ruled and where the boundaries between past and present felt thin. Even if populations had dwindled, these sites retained ritual importance, and some were revisited for offerings, pilgrimages, or the reaffirmation of lineage ties to ancient dynasties. Oral traditions likely wove the memory of these cities into stories of origin, glory, and warning, preserving a sense that the greatness of the past carried lessons for the present. In a world now more politically fragmented, the ruins also served as symbols of what centralized power had once achieved, and perhaps of the dangers of overreach. The landscape itself bore the marks of earlier intensification, with terraces, canals, and modified forests that continued to influence how people farmed and settled the land. Thus, the past remained embedded in the environment, shaping choices long after the political systems that created it had dissolved. Meanwhile, new centers in the northern lowlands and along the coasts were rising, their architecture and art styles showing both continuity with classic traditions and innovative adaptations to new realities. Trade routes shifted, linking communities through maritime networks that connected the Maya to wider Mesoamerican spheres. The cultural fabric remained richly woven, with shared calendars, deities, and mythic narratives binding diverse regions together despite political disunity. The sight of ancient monuments emerging from the jungle canopy must have been both inspiring and humbling, a reminder of human achievement and fragility at once. In this way, the ruins acted as teachers, silent yet powerful, conveying through their sheer scale and endurance the story of a civilization that had reached extraordinary heights and then transformed in response to profound challenges. The Maya did not forget their cities. Instead, they carried their memory forward, integrating the legacy of the classic era into a new chapter of cultural evolution that would continue to unfold in ways both familiar and surprising.
When people speak of the fall of the Maya civilization, they often imagine a sudden end, as if an entire people vanished into the jungle along with their cities. But the truth is both more complex and more enduring. For what changed was not the existence of the Maya, but the form of their world. The grand classic capitals did decline, their dynasties fractured, their monuments no longer raised in towering succession. Yet the Maya language, knowledge, and identity persisted across generations, carried in the memories, rituals, and daily practices of communities who adapted to a transformed landscape. In the centuries after the great southern cities faded, new political centers rose in other regions, especially in the northern lowlands, where places like Chichen Itza and later Mayapan became hubs of power, trade, and cultural exchange. Architecture evolved, showing influences from distant parts of Mesoamerica, while still preserving deeply Maya concepts of sacred space and cosmic order. The people continued to track time with intricate calendars, to honor deities tied to rain, maize, and the cycles of the heavens, and to tell stories that connected them to their ancestors and the primordial creation of the world. Farmers refined their techniques to suit local conditions. Fishers plied coastal waters. Traders moved goods along sea and land routes. And artisans produced ceramics, textiles, and carvings that reflected both continuity and innovation. Even when later waves of upheaval came with foreign conquest, centuries after the classic collapse, Maya communities endured, preserving elements of their worldview in ways both visible and hidden. Today, millions of Maya descendants live across Mesoamerica, speaking languages that evolved from those of the ancient inscriptions and maintaining traditions that echo practices from 1,000 years ago. The temples rising above the forest are not tombstones of a vanished civilization, but monuments within a living cultural landscape, reminders of a time when certain cities flourished at an extraordinary scale, and of the resilience that allowed Maya society to survive immense environmental, political, and social change. The so-called fall of the Maya is therefore better understood as a transformation, a reorganization of life rather than an extinction.
Their story teaches that civilizations are not defined solely by their tallest buildings or most powerful kings, but by the ability of their people to adapt, remember, and continue. In the quiet stones of abandoned plazas and in the vibrant communities of the present, the Maya world still speaks, not as a lost civilization, but as one that endured by changing shape when the old order could no longer hold.